why Che Guevara? Why is he the polarizing figure? Why is his face the most reproduced image on earth? It isn't what he did that was so special. He didn't conquer half the world like Genghis Khan or plunge it into catastrophe like Hitler. And yet, his name remains a rallying cry for some and a blasphemy to others. He's recognizable not because we know him, but because we recognize something in him. Che Guevara is a face. He's an idea, a symbol, a belief. Restless, cunning, and bold, he may not have changed the world in his lifetime, but his legacy just might. Our story begins on June 14th, 1928, in the port city of Rosario, Argentina. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born into a poor family with noble ancestry, but even with their fortune long gone, his parents' rich lifestyle remained. They lived in summer houses, drove cars they could barely afford, employed servants, all the while knowing they could fall back on friends and family. And as a spoiled first child, Ernesto's early life was riddled with ease and comfort. His mother cared for him deeply, and he had all the material needs to make a child happy. But Ernesto couldn't have become Che without a dose of hardship, and fate would hand him his first obstacle. At the age of 5, he was diagnosed with a debilitating form of asthma, and it forced his family to restructure their lives around it. On doctors' advice, they moved to the dry air of Alta Gracia, hoping it would help him breathe. But regardless of his environment, asthma would follow him, and it was certainly vital to who he became. For most of his childhood, Ernesto was too sick to attend regular school, requiring his mother to teach him at home. And what emerged from this childhood was a kid untamed by his confinement. He was wild, impulsive, and fiercely competitive. When he was fit enough to attend school, he was noted for his disobedience, drinking ink, eating chalk, exploring restricted areas, and once tossed lit firecrackers into a neighbor's dinner party. And as is usually the case, Ernesto's antics also reflected the turbulence of his home life. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, and Celia, his mother, regularly got into shouting matches, stemming mostly from Ernesto Sr.'s incessant infidelity, which, like father like son, was a trait Che would mirror in his own life. Individually, Ernesto's parents were both quite unique characters. His mother was one of the first women in Argentina to drive. She wore trousers, smoked cigarettes, which were all taboo at the time. Her husband once described her as imprudent from birth and attracted to danger, which might explain a lot about their son. Ernesto Sr., by contrast, was emotional, cautious, and almost maternal in his protectiveness. They were both quite political, but in the male-dominated space of Argentinian politics, Ernesto Sr. was more visibly active. He once declared he wanted to fight for the Paraguayans during the Chaco War. He did not. He did help create a committee that sent aid to the anti-fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War and threw himself into Acción Argentina, a pro-Allied movement during World War II. It also helped that the province they lived in, Cordoba, was a hotbed of student protests and left-wing organizing. In 1943, when the military overthrew President Castillo, repressive measures quickly led teachers and students in Cordoba to protest. And if you know a little about Che, you might expect young Ernesto to jump at this opportunity. But as is actually more fitting, he called it a futile gesture, stating he would only march if given a revolver. And this all-or-nothing mindset was a trait that would define much of his life. Another moment that hinted at Ernesto's future came shortly after President Juan Perón rose to power, who faced intense criticism because of his personal ties to Mussolini's Italy and his early signs of authoritarianism. The United States was also uneasy and pressured him to abandon his neutral stance in World War II and formally side with the Allies. Perón eventually gave in, which was a decision celebrated across Argentina. But again, young Ernesto didn't share that excitement. He despised the Nazis, but also hated Argentina bowing to the US, and this distrust of foreign influence would also be one of his defining beliefs. It It's important here to note that as with all great figures, it's tempting to see signs of the future in every detail of Che's childhood. But the truth is, nothing in his early years marked him as a future revolutionary. His ideas and sense of identity were taking shape, but even in the politically charged town of Cordoba, he remained largely on the sidelines. He was broadly aware of politics, occasionally heated, but far from immersed in it. He finished secondary school in 1946, and influenced by his grandmother's passing and a curiosity likely stemming from his own illness, he decided on a path of medicine. And so, in 1947, he enrolled at the medical school at the University of Buenos Aires. This period of his life can be defined as one of intellectual incubation. Alongside his medical coursework, he read voraciously, moving between science, philosophy, and poetry. Politically, he still remained unaligned. He would challenge people's arguments and dissect their ideologies, but refused to pledge himself to any side. His stance was one of pure ethics, valuing personal principles over party politics. Yet, for all his learning, something inside began to stir. He hungered for knowledge, but sensed that books and lectures alone were not enough, and he believed that only by venturing out could he truly understand the world he lived in. And that tension would spark the first of many journeys that would define who he would become. In 1950, Ernesto fitted his bicycle with a small engine and set off into the interior of Argentina. The bike rattled beneath him as he wheezed his way through a 4,500-kilometer journey. And though an antithesis to his life up to this point, along the road he discovered parts of the world and of himself that he hadn't known were there. In his early notebooks, he wrote about the people he met, the shape of the landscape, the introspective thoughts that come when you're alone. He wrote about lepers and laborers, the men who lived at the edges of society. And in those reflections, you can see a growing discomfort taking place. A realization that the country he lived in was built on two realities that barely intersected. Until then, Argentina had always seemed European-esque to him, cultured, modern, forward-looking. But the longer he traveled, the more that illusion crumbled. He began to see that his home had been built on blindness. His country wanted to look like Europe, but it had to bury half of itself to do so. This trip, while unique, wasn't dramatic enough to transform him overnight, but it planted the understanding that exploring the unknown could teach much more than any classroom. And indeed, that seed grew quickly. Not long after returning home, he would lay plans for a much more grand, and now famous, voyage across South America. But it was this, humble by comparison first trip, that set Ernesto on the path toward a life of travel, discovery, and ultimately, revolution. Along the roads of daydreams, we reached remote countries, navigated on tropical seas, and visited all of Asia. And suddenly, the question arose, what if we went to North America? To North America, how? With La Poderosa, man. That was how the idea of his next trip emerged. Sitting and daydreaming with his old friend Alberto, they decided to embark on this ambitious journey. Their vehicle of choice was a battered 500cc motorcycle they dubbed La Poderosa, or the Mighty One. It would be the vessel towards the rest of their lives. In their fantasy, they imagined traveling as far as North America, maybe even Asia, but reality would humble them. Their adventure covered far less ground than they dreamed, but even if the distance they covered was humbler than planned, the lessons Ernesto absorbed along the way mattered far more to him and to history than any miles they never traveled. The two friends braved the Andes and arrived in Chile, a country of vast deserts and isolated mining towns. While traveling in the north, they encountered a man and his wife, frozen stiff in the desert night, hugging one another. He and Alberto shared their blankets with them and listened to their story. The couple had been evicted after the husband was jailed for leading a strike. Several of his friends had disappeared, taken away by police for defying the mine bosses. Now, they were left to wander from settlement to settlement, blacklisted for being a troublemaker. Che would later write, "It was one of the times when I felt the most cold, but it was also the time when I felt a little more fraternity with this, for me, strange human species." Soon after this encounter, they arrived at the Chuquicamata copper mine, then the largest open pit mine in the world, and a potent symbol of foreign exploitation. The mine was owned by the US-based Anaconda and Kennecott companies, and the American managers ran it like a fiefdom. The Americans, Ernesto noted, were blonde, efficient, and impertinent masters who lose millions of pesos in a strike just to deny a few centavos more to a poor worker. It was the first clear glimpse of a pattern he would see again and again as they journeyed on. Their next stop was Lima, where Ernesto met Dr. Hugo Pese, a Marxist physician who had dedicated his life to medicine among the poor. Pese recognized something within the young Argentine, and over the course of a week, he spoke of ideas that widened Ernesto's eyes. He told Ernesto that disease was not an isolated misfortune, but a predictable result of poverty, exploitation, and historical injustice. He explained that doctors could treat wounds, but unless the structures that produced those wounds were changed, suffering was bound to continue. For Ernesto, whose instincts had always leaned toward medical service, this was a revelation. Pese showed him that medicine and revolutionary politics were not opposing callings, but two paths toward the same moral duty. Both attempts to confront human suffering, but one addressing its symptoms and the other its roots. Years later, when Ernesto had become Che, he would dedicate his first book to Pese, to Dr. Hugo Pese, who, without knowing it perhaps, provoked a great change in my attitude toward life and society. Of course, his adventurous spirit stayed, but it was now firmly directed toward fighting the inequality he had witnessed so many times across Latin America. The road then carried the duo right into the jaws of violence. Colombia at the time was in the grip of La Violencia, a brutal civil war sparked by the assassination of populist leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, and when they arrived, their travels were suffocated by armed patrols, military checkpoints, and a population that was bracing for the next inevitable eruption. Ernesto, usually fearless and with a penchant for tenuous situations, wrote of Colombia's atmosphere as an asphyxiating climate that the Colombians can stand if they want, but we're beating it as soon as we can. True to his word, after getting arrested for a misunderstanding with a police officer and eventually released, Ernesto and Alberto knew it was time to go. They quickly crossed into Venezuela, and yet again they met another face of Latin American inequality. Ernesto saw American cars zooming through affluent neighborhoods, juxtaposed with the sprawling barrios where the poor lived in squalor. And after 8 months on this eye-opening motorcycle trip, witnessing injustice left and right, one might expect Ernesto's heart to have softened to the plight of all oppressed people. Yet, it was in their last stop of Venezuela that Ernesto's own ingrained prejudices surfaced most prominently. Among Caracas's population were many black Venezuelans and Caribbean immigrants, and Ernesto commented in his private notes, "The blacks, those magnificent examples of the African race who have conserved their racial purity for a lack of affinity with washing. The black is indolent and fanciful. He spends his money on frivolity and drink." Such racist remarks, along with homophobic comments in his diaries, are often brought up when people try to dunk on Che. But I argue that this was not yet Che. He was an in-between of the boy who was born into a noble family and the figure we now know. He was not yet the man that would lead a fight against the white colonialists in Congo, the man who defended indigenous peasants in Bolivia, the man who fought for Afro-Cuban rights, stating, "Today, the people stand at the door of the university, and it is the university that must be flexible. It must color itself black, mulatto, worker, peasant, or else be left without doors. And then, the people will tear it apart and paint it with the colors they see fit." I say, these ugly remarks are important, not because it condemns him, but because it shows how far he eventually traveled from the worldview he inherited. And with that, we close the chapter on the famous motorcycle journey. I've moved through it quickly, but it was truly a grueling 8 months. Their journey across nearly 8,000 miles was full of hardship, and by August 1952, he was sick and worn down. He accepted an offer to return home on a cargo plane. And while he may have come back relatively unchanged to his family and friends, the man who stepped back into Argentina was not the one who left it. How he understood the world and his place in it was fundamentally altered. I see myself immolated in the genuine revolution, the great equalizer of individual will. I steel my body, ready to do battle, and prepare myself to be a sacred space within which the bestial howl of the triumphant proletariat can resound with new energy and new hope. He was now committed. In the months and years that followed, that nagging voice of revolutionary conscience would continue to nudge Ernesto down the path of action. When Ernesto got back to Argentina, he was determined to finish his studies quickly. He speed-ran the rest of his medical degree, passing 3 tests in 1 month, 10 in another, and a few months later passed his final exam. But as was his nature, he wasn't going to take a research post, work in a clinic, or begin the long, conventional path towards a practicing physician. Just a month after graduation, he set his eyes on yet another journey, this time with a friend named Kalika Ferrer, and would push him into political terrains he had only gotten a glimpse of before. And they couldn't have found a more illuminating first stop than Bolivia. The country was living through the afterglow of its revolution. The National Revolutionary Movement, or MNR, came to power promising a Bolivia built for the people. The army was disbanded, and the mines, the heart of the country's economy, were nationalized. For the first time, the country's indigenous and working-class majority stood at the center of political life. The revolution felt tangible to Ernesto. He saw peasants carrying rifles on the streets. The government spoke of plans to remake the nation, including redistributing land and expanding education. In a mine he was visiting, an engineer proudly showed the spot where company guards once set up machine guns to massacre striking miners. But now, the mine belonged to the people. But despite all of this good, as the weeks went on, Ernesto began to see the truth of this revolution, that the changes were real, but incomplete. He later described Bolivia as independent in law, but dependent in fact. The new state was still economically dependent on foreign powers, resulting in the halting of reforms under threats from the US and other Western buyers. Revolution, for all its promise, could not escape the reach of foreign demand. For Guevara, who viewed the landscape as an outsider, Bolivia was a revelation. Never before had he seen such political hope living side by side with such political fragility. And as he prepared to continue north, he would carry the lesson that a revolution could not survive without truly breaking free from foreign chains. From Bolivia, Ernesto and Kalika traveled through Peru, Ecuador, Panama, and Costa Rica. The deeper they went, the more visible the American shadow became. In country after country, they encountered the fingerprints of the infamous United Fruit Company. The exploitation Ernesto had seen at Chile's copper mines were only a sliver of what he saw now. The agribusiness giant controlled millions of acres of plantations, railroads, ports, and hospitals. American managers and their families lived in segregated enclaves of comfortable housing, while the native workers were reduced to sordid quarters, laboring 12-hour days under the watchful eye of armed guards. Labor unions were infiltrated, strikes were crushed long before they could grow into a threat, and reformist governments were threatened or overthrown by the US government if they protested. But when Ernesto and Kalika finally crossed into Guatemala, they entered a country that defied the pattern of the entire region. It was led by Jacobo Arbenz, a former military officer turned reformer who had come to power promising to redistribute land and modernize the economy. Vast tracts of idle land were being taken back and redistributed to the tens of thousands of landless peasant families. It was the first serious challenge to the economic colonialism Ernesto had seen. The atmosphere inside Guatemala was electric. Students, poets, and exiles from all over Latin America flocked to witness the birth of a democratic revolution. For Ernesto, whose writings acted as a sort of litmus test of his politics, was as explicit as ever. Along the way, I passed through the dominions of United Fruit, convincing myself once again how terrible the capitalist octopuses are. I have sworn before a picture of the old and mourned comrade Stalin that I won't rest until I see those octopuses annihilated. In Guatemala, I will perfect myself and achieve what I need to be an authentic revolutionary. He quickly fell into a circle of fellow Argentines and debated politics over endless cups of coffee. He also met a group of political exiles from all over South America, including a Peruvian economist named Hilda Gadia. She would later become Ernesto's first wife and was an important presence during those years. Through her, Ernesto met the Torres family, exiles from Nicaragua whose home had become a kind of informal embassy for displaced intellectuals. It was there that Ernesto met a group of Cubans who would mark a new chapter in his life: Nico Lopez, Armando Arencibia, Bigotes Lopez, and Mario Dalmau. They were survivors of a failed uprising led by Fidel Castro. The Moncada rebels, or Moncadistas, had become minor legends among the Latin left for challenging the brutal and corrupt dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. To earn a little money, Ernesto joined the Cubans selling products on commission. Their humor, their warmth, and their stubborn vision of their future revolutionary success made him feel a part of something. It was during these times that Nico gave him the nickname El Che, a nod to Ernesto's Argentine habit of using Che as a filler word. But for all of the optimism and visible reform taking place in Guatemala, the clock was unfortunately running out. The bold actions of President Arbenz had elicited the fury of powerful parties. United Fruit was lobbying furiously in Washington, portraying Arbenz as a dangerous communist and demanding intervention. In response, the CIA named its next move Operation PB Success, designed to topple and replace Arbenz with a pro-American regime. A force of Guatemalan exiles and mercenaries led by Carlos Castillo Armas were training in Honduras under the direction of the CIA. On June 18, 1953, they crossed into Guatemala, with American-supplied airplanes bombing the city. In his first taste of war, Ernesto enlisted in the medical brigades and joined civilian patrols to guard the city at night. He wrote to his mother that he felt ashamed for having as much fun as a monkey. He described the gunfire, the panic, the chaos, and his own strange calm in the middle of it. A magic sense of invulnerability, he said. But no matter the passion of Ernesto and thousands like him, the Arbenz government avoided striking across the border and refused to arm workers' militias. They let the invaders advance into the country to avoid any pretext for an American response. Meanwhile, Arbenz's government filed protests at the United Nations, hoping for an intervention. But the US leaned on its allies to block any inquiry into the invasion, and they succeeded by a single vote. Guatemala, betrayed, was entirely alone. Within a week, Arbenz's army was demoralized, divided, and refused to fight. Arbenz resigned on June 27th, believing that surrender might spare the country from annihilation. By July 3rd, the liberator, Castillo Armas, flew triumphantly into Guatemala City with the American ambassador at his side. The revolution had lasted a decade. Its defeat took 10 days. The new regime reversed land reforms, burned books, and outlawed unions. Meanwhile, illiterate citizens were barred from voting and suspects disappeared overnight, and the United States patted itself on the back, celebrating democracy. Amidst the chaos, Ernesto sought refuge in the Argentine embassy, where dozens of exiles slept on floors and waited for safe passage. When a seat opened up on a plane back to Buenos Aires, he refused it. writing that Guatemala had shown him the face of the enemy, and that he would not return to Argentina until I know how to fight him. Mexico was never meant to be more than a stopover, a place to rest after Guatemala's collapse, to wait out the uncertainty of exile, but it would become a launching pad for the most crucial chapter of Ernesto's life. Mexico City had long been a refuge for political exiles, and by the mid-1950s it contained a mix that did not exist anywhere else in Latin America. Veterans of Spain's Civil War, Jewish refugees from Europe, Latin American dissidents waiting for their home countries to stabilize. Ernesto would soon fit right in, meeting union leaders and activists from across Latin America. Among them were the aforementioned Cubans he had met in Guatemala. But over the next couple of months, Ernesto went back to the intellectual incubation days of college. He took various odd jobs, read voraciously, and wrote down his evolving political thoughts. But they were different now, sharper, more explicit, more Marxist than ever before. In an exchange of letters with his mother, Ernesto tried to give shape to what had changed. The way in which the gringos treat America had been provoking a growing indignation in me, but at the same time, I studied the Marxist theory behind the reasons for their actions, and I found it scientific. Afterward came Guatemala. Responding to his mother's concerns over his growing closeness to communism, he acknowledged the depth of that transformation. At what moment I left the path of reason and took on something akin to faith, I cannot tell you. The path was very long and with a lot of backward steps, but the destination was clear. Ernesto Guevara had crossed the line and was now Che Guevara. No longer merely a radical observer or a restless critic of injustice, he had committed himself to Marxism, to revolution, and to communism as a way of understanding the world and acting within it. Amidst his political radicalization, his revolutionary trajectory would deepen in June of 1955, when Raúl Castro was released from prison following political pressures and arrived in Mexico to regroup with the exiled Cubans. Che was invited to meet the new arrival at the home he was staying at. They hit it off immediately. They spoke the same political language. Both believed in Latin American political institutions being too corrupt, external influences too strong, and peaceful changes too vulnerable. Raúl spoke of his unwavering faith in his brother's ability to lead such a revolution, and within days, Raúl Castro brought Che to meet the recently arrived Fidel Castro, and it was a moment that would change the course of both of their lives. Che later wrote about that first encounter. I talked all night with Fidel, and by the morning, I was the doctor of his new expedition. I was particularly impressed with Fidel. I shared his optimism. We needed to act, to struggle, to materialize our beliefs, stop whining and fight. And what they were fighting against was everything Che had come to despise about Latin America's political order. Fulgencio Batista had seized power in a US-backed coup, suspended the Constitution, and ruled through corruption, repression, and a security apparatus notorious for torture and disappearances. Meanwhile, American companies controlled key industries like sugar, utilities, and casinos, while most Cubans saw little benefit from the wealth around them. For Che, joining a group of committed revolutionaries led by a charismatic, capable leader like Fidel was the perfect opportunity to act on the anger he'd built up over the past few years. This was the watershed of his transformation. The next year was one of singular focus and training. The Cuban exiles drilled in secret on ranches outside the city, practicing marksmanship, studying guerrilla tactics, and learning to move as a unit. Che was the only one that was not Cuban, and it took some time for him to gain respect. But that would not deter him. He worked harder and pushed further than everyone else and was completely committed. By autumn 1956, preparations were finally in place. Fidel had managed to purchase an old yacht, the Grandma, and the group was ordered to assemble near the Gulf Coast. With the weight of history on their shoulders, they would set sail on November 25th, 1956. Before their departure, Che wrote a farewell letter to his mother. "The skies have not turned black, the constellations have not come out of their orbits, nor have there been floods or overly insolent hurricanes. The signs are good. They signal victory. But if they are mistaken, and in the end even the gods make mistakes, then I believe I can say like a poet whom you don't know, I will only take to my grave the nightmare of an unfinished song. I kiss you again, with all the love of a goodbye that resists being total. Your son." Actions speak louder than words, and only days after the crash landing of the grandma did Che show who he'd become. The grandma had limped across the Gulf of Mexico, stuffed with men, rifles, and seasickness, and what was meant to be a 5-day voyage took 7. They missed their landing spot, lost their guide, and ran aground on a sandbar in broad daylight. By the time the rebels stumbled ashore, half the men could barely stand from lack of food and water. The blow they were supposed to strike wasn't even a whimper, and 3 days into their trek inwards, they were ambushed at Alegria de Pio. The Cuban army found the rebels easy prey. Gunfire tore through the brush, and the rebels' shouts turned to screams. Packs and rifles were dropped in the mud as they clawed for cover that didn't exist. And in the middle of it all, Che revealed who he was. At his feet were medical supplies and ammunition. He hesitated for only a moment, then stepped over the bandages and grabbed the bullets. With a neck wound from enemy fire, Che managed to survive the encounter, but most weren't so lucky. In the end, only 20 survived out of the 80 that left Mexico. His asthma attacks were a constant burden, triggered by the damp Cuba air and steep climbs, but he refused to let that stop him. He pushed through wheezing fits up the mountain trails, sometimes arriving last, but arriving nonetheless. And this stubbornness under physical duress earned him a unique kind of respect among the rebels, for he never asked for special treatment, even when he could barely breathe. By January 1957, the guerrillas had regained enough strength to go on the offensive. Their first battle came at a tiny army outpost called La Plata, where they launched a surprise assault and overran the garrison within minutes. The fight was short and brutal. The rebels burned the barracks, killed a notorious local ruler, and seized desperately needed weapons and ammunition. Amidst the chaos, Guevara fired at a fleeing soldier and hit him. All he wrote after was, "He had a bullet under the heart. He was dead." In the months that followed La Plata, Castro's rebels moved more confidently, carrying out raids that dispelled the government's claim that the rebels were annihilated at Alegria de Pio. And through it all, in the treacherous life of a guerrilla, Che quickly stood out for 2 things: courage and severity. When Batista's planes strafed the treetops or bombed rebel hideouts, most men threw themselves under cover, but Che would stay behind under fire to collect scattered weapons. On the march, he volunteered for the hardest tasks. And before long, Fidel recognized his tactical instincts and his unwavering commitment, and after a particularly intense fight that left the rebel band bloodied but victorious, Castro promoted Guevara on the spot, to a rank only held by Fidel himself. From then on, he wasn't Dr. Guevara or El Che. He was Commandant Che Guevara. Che was not a natural orator like Fidel, who could sway a village or a group of rebels with a single speech, but what he lacked in communication, he made up with the order he inspired. New recruits were called the shirtless ones, and they had to prove themselves by taking on the worst jobs before they even got to touch a rifle. Those who faltered or disobeyed discovered the harsh reality of living a rebel life. I explained once again why desertion was punishable by death, and why anyone who betrayed the revolution must be condemned, Che wrote after ordering the execution of a would-be deserter. When a young rebel shot himself, whether out of panic, despair, or clumsiness, Che refused military honors in his death, saying, "Committing suicide under such conditions should be repudiated, whatever good qualities the man may have possessed." War, in his mind, left no room for indulgences. You survived by deserving to. Yet the same severity that made him feared was paired with a solidarity that even those who disliked his manner couldn't help but admire. Che shared every hardship with his column. He shared every danger, went hungry when supplies ran low, marched at the same pace, and slept on the same muddy ground. A Uruguayan journalist who visited the camp would write, "The guerrillas of La Mesa reflected a discipline that was more intimate, derived from the men's confidence in their leaders." They paid Che back with the same virile reticence, with an adherence that went deeper than mere obedience. Che garnered respect and formed a cohesive, committed group that only he could, and he was now an indispensable part of the revolution. His role straddled the line between field commander and administrator in what was a territorio libre, a free zone in the Sierra Maestra. He oversaw clinics for sick fighters and locals and supervised schools for guerrilla recruits. His intellectual habits resurfaced in the form of an integral education program, as he insisted that new fighters should understand the political and moral stakes of the struggle. He knew that communism as a term still frightened many Cubans, so he avoided the label. Instead, he spoke about dignity, about land for those who worked it, and about ending the abuses peasants had suffered under landlords and soldiers. He broke the revolution down into simple lines: rich and poor, oppressor and oppressed, those who had always decided, and those who had never been asked. And slowly, the mood in the surrounding villages began to shift. Where the rebels had once been seen as dangerous, they were now seen as protectors. Peasants who had kept their distance began to offer food, share intelligence, and send their sons to join the fight. What Che was discovering in real time was what he would later call FOCO theory, that a small, disciplined guerrilla nucleus could awaken a broader popular uprising. And by early 1958, Guevara's column had grown from a few exhausted men into a dozen fighters. To compensate for the growing group, the rebels created supply lines throughout the countryside. They launched a tiny newspaper, El Cubano Libre, to counter the regime's propaganda. Workshops were erected in the forests, producing homemade grenades and rockets. The rebels had built an effective parallel state. While Castro focused on broader strategy and forming alliances, Guevara kept the liberated zone functioning. But these successes brought the attention of the state, and Batista moved to crush them. What began as a police effort to wipe out the handful of bandits turned into a full-scale counterinsurgency. Government troops burned huts suspected of sheltering guerrillas, bombed mountain hamlets, and cleared communities from the foothills to starve the rebels of support. In turn, the guerrillas became bolder. They came out of the mountains more frequently, launching raids on outposts, ambushing convoys, and burning sugarcane fields owned by the corrupt and powerful. In Havana, Batista's officials continued diminishing the significance of the rebels, but foreign diplomats and Cuban newspapers were not convinced. The outside world had first learned that Castro was even alive in his famous interview in 1957. But now, a year later, journalists wrote about a prototype of another kind of Cuba. They documented a camp with its own butcher shop and communal bakery, about courts that settled local disputes, about schools and clinics for all, a community where leaders and rank and file ate the same food, walked the same trails, and laid under the same bombardment. It was in this context that Argentine journalist Jorge Massetti asked the question that many outside observers had. Why was an Argentine risking his life in a Cuban war? In the first place, I consider my fatherland to be not only Argentina, but all of America. What is more, I cannot conceive that it can be called interference to give myself personally, to give myself completely, to offer my blood for a cause I consider just and popular, to help a people liberate themselves from tyranny. No country until now has denounced the American interference in Cuban affairs, nor has a single daily newspaper accused the Yankees of helping Batista massacre his people. But many are concerned about me. I am the meddling foreigner, who who helps the rebels with his flesh and blood. Massetti's interview was broadcast across Latin America, and for many listeners, this was their first encounter with Che's real voice. By mid-1958, Che Guevara had marched far from the nobody he was just a couple years back, the doctor with no military background and no Cuban ties, to a hardened leader, feared by the regime and respected throughout the countryside. Yet through it all, he understood that this was, at its core, a moral project. He saw himself, still in a way, as a doctor, with imperialism and injustice as a kind of illness, and with Cuba as his first patient.